The Falcons are getting some of their 2022 mojo back to bolster their O-line depth, but will it solve the run game woes that we saw on display in Week 3?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code Locked On NFL for $20 off your first purchase. So, guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Mr. Drew, aka Sirius Black, aka Mr. AKA, and I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for a very long time, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. I think all of you guys that go strong with me as everydayers, right, to make this illustrious podcast your first listen or first watch each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode is our All-22 review. I've watched the film from Week 3's loss to the Kansas City Chiefs. We'll break down some of the things that stood out to me on today's episode. But first, we got to talk about the offensive line roster moves that the Falcons made Tuesday afternoon, placing center Drew Dalman on injured reserve with a high ankle sprain. He'll miss at least 4 weeks due to the rules with guys being able to come back from the IR. The Falcons did not place Kaleb McGary, who's dealing with an MCL sprain, on IR too. My assumption is that the Falcons are currently optimistic that he will be able to return in less than 4 weeks. We'll see. I expect him to miss a similar amount of time, but it really depends on the severity of the knee sprain and, his pain tolerance and all those various things. So we'll see on Kaleb McGary. But the Falcons replaced Drew Dalman on their roster by elevating Elijah Wilkinson, the guard, from their practice squad. They re-signed former Falcon center/guard Matt Hennessy to their practice squad to replace Wilkinson. Wilkinson was the starting left guard for the Falcons in 2022, Matthew Bergeron's predecessor at that left guard spot. Matt Hennessy was Drew Dalman's predecessor as the starting center in 2021. Did see some snaps in 2022 as that left guard, and both of those guys, provided a boost in that 2022 season where this offensive line was so outstanding as a run blocking unit. And so that's kind of why I like this move, right? The first reason is now there is far less probability that we will be forced to have to watch Kyle Hinton step on the field in the event of an injury to one of these guards with Wilkinson and Hennessy now. And also, maybe you get some of that 2022 mojo back, right? And that's going to matter because of the injuries that the Falcons are dealing with on the offensive line. That's a perfect segue to get into some of the run game woes and why it didn't work against the Chiefs as part of our All-22 review. In addition to the injuries that you had up front with Dalman and McGary exiting the game in the second quarter, I think the main issue was you didn't have the perimeter blocking that you got a week ago. That was a big factor in why the Falcons' success. Locked On Falcons Insiders saw that on my extended All-22 breakdown from last week in that Eagles game, breaking down several plays where you got good perimeter blocking from your receivers, from your tackles, Drake London, Kyle Pitts, Ray McCloud. I think Pitts mostly helped serve in this game. Again, we grade Kyle Pitts' blocking on a curve. We don't treat him like George Kittle or anything like that. London took a small step back, but Ray McCloud made a major step back as far as the perimeter blocking went. There were at least 4 runs that I counted charting the game that were blown up because he missed a block. Ray McCloud is a good run blocker for a receiver of his size, 5'9", 190 pounds, but it did not show out in this game. I think the other contributing factor to why the Chiefs were so successful stopping the run is that they played a lot more big nickel, putting a safety in the slot, Shamari Connor, who blew up a couple of those runs on Ray McCloud blocks, as well as the Chiefs also having bigger bodies up front than what the Eagles did. That was something that we talked about in last week's All-22 review, where the Eagles were playing with light bodies up front, and that benefited your perimeter blocking in a major way. And the Chiefs playing with bigger bodies up front, had a negative reaction. And so we saw the outside zone being much less effective in this game than it has been in the early weeks of the season, and a big factor in why the run game wasn't working. And we wonder with the injuries, will it continue to be an issue moving forward, even against defenses that aren't as good as the Chiefs are up front? And, one of the things I've noted several times on this podcast is there's a big step back, especially as an outside zone blocker, from going from Kaleb McGary to Storm Norton. As I've mentioned on episodes of Locked On Sports Atlanta yesterday on the Atlanta Football Party, go check it out. Kaleb McGary is basically the part of the engine that runs your offense, your run game. I'm sorry. Him and Lindstrom. And it's basically going from like a V8 engine to a V4 engine now that McGary's out. And we talked about this exact same issue last year when coming off of that Jets game where McGary and several other offensive linemen got injured going into that Bucs game, when Storm Norton was starting that game at right tackle. And in that week, we talked a lot in the lead up to that Bucs game was the quarterback is going to have to do a lot more of the heavy lifting on the offense because the run game is probably not going to be there. And we needed Desmond Ridder to have that breakthrough performance last year against the Bucs, and he obviously failed in that regard. Now we're hoping with the upgrade that the Falcons have made at the quarterback position this offseason with Kirk Cousins that they won't fail in that regard with the quarterback needing to do more, have the heavy lifting, given some of the concerns we have with the run game. But I think you still have the same issue in terms of the quarterback in the passing game going to have to do a lot more. Now, it's still early in the season, and so I think Kirk has been effective, relatively speaking, but like he's going to need to be more effective at a more critical juncture today in the season than he will be later in the season. And that's going to be a challenge for the Falcons, right? As we discussed with Josh Kendall on yesterday's episode, you got 3 consecutive divisional games coming up, starting this week with the Saints and Bucs and then the Panthers. And your playoff hopes kind of ride on these games, right? Not to mention you have 5 divisional games because you got rematches against both the Bucs and Saints shortly thereafter. 5 of your next 7 games are divisional games. And you cannot afford to have a losing record in the division over these next, 3 to 7 weeks. That's going to put you behind that 8 ball, and that's going to put even more pressure on Kirk and the rest of this offense to dig yourself out of the hole later in the season at this point in time. And so this is not just a Kirk Cousins issue. This is also a Zach Robinson issue. Kirk is a system quarterback. And what I mean by that, when I say that word, is that you're not going to see Kirk extending plays. He's not going to create off structure. He's not going to create outside the system with those second reaction plays due to the limited mobility. And you've talked quite a bit. You've heard me talk quite a bit about, that's why it's important for this team to have checkdowns in this offense because that's where your second reaction plays are going to go. It's not going to be Kirk extending plays. And so if the first few progressions aren't there, you're going to have to check the ball down. And that's why it's important that your offensive line also steps up, because if you need your running backs to stay in and protect, that's one less option in the passing game that you have for those check down options. And so it also emphasizes the importance of Zach Robinson's play calling, right? That system thing that we're talking about. That's what we're talking about with the system, where you need to design an offense where those first few reads are open so you aren't having to rely on Kirk's non-existent, mobility and second reaction ability and whatnot to work and whatnot. And so that gets us into some of the criticism I have for Zach Robinson's play calling. We'll talk a little bit more about that later in the episode. But to me, nothing was egregious in this game from a play calling standpoint. Even that 4th down call at the end of the game that I didn't agree with but it's not something I'm going to get too bent out of shape over. That's always been my stance with play calling, on a given game where 60 plus plays, you're going to have a couple of mess ups. I've likened it to if you had a 60 question quiz and you missed 2 or 3 problems, you're still going to get an A on that quiz, which is why I think people tend to overrate 1 or 2 bad play calls in a game to be like that's the reason why we lost the game. And it's like, it contributed, but it's not the reason. So, you're probably sitting there, but Aaron, you spent a whole week on this podcast after week 1 complaining about Zach Robinson's play call. And it's like, yes, that was egregious. That's what I was referring to yesterday with Josh Kendall. Unless it's egregious, I'm not going to sit here and spend too much energy on it. And to me, week 1, the game planning and some of the stuff in that game was egregiously bad. And so that game has been flushed, right? It's where that game belongs, right? That whole thing, it's been flushed down the toilet. It's sewage now, right? It's where that game belongs. And so we're going to move forward hoping that we can forget about week 1 when it comes to Zach Robinson. But we'll circle back to Zach Robinson's, some criticism of Zach Robinson's play calling, particularly when it comes to his uses of Kyle Pitts, among other things. But overall, I don't think anything Zach Robinson has done in the last 2 weeks is the end of the world. It's just a work in progress, and that's going to be just something that we're going to have to deal with over the course of the season. But talking about one play caller to the other one, we'll talk about the defensive coordinator in Jimmy Lake now and talk about his coverages against Kansas City, the team's pass rush woes, and what was the causes behind the poor run defense as we continue today's Locked On Falcons All-22 review. But first, guys, I want to tell you about how you can start your NFL season big with a big return from FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because when you have that hunch in the middle of the game, whether you want to check out the latest stats or view the live play-by-play, you can do so much at FanDuel on the very same page that you will place your bets, right? And you can get started today with a $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Win or lose, that's what it means. Guaranteed. $200 in bonus bets. You put down $5, FanDuel's going to give you $200. All you have to do is head it over to FanDuel.com and make sure you check out this week's upcoming line between the Falcons and Saints. Maybe you want to check out, the odds for Georgia to win the national title or whatever you're into. FanDuel has you covered. So check out FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So talking about Jimmy Lake, I think one of the things that Jimmy Lake did in this game, he did diversify his coverage. I was very fascinated to see how he would handle Mahomes, how he would try to deal with an elite quarterback like Mahomes. He diversified his coverages. Based off my charting, the Falcons had a pretty even split with a lot of their coverages, which contrasts to how they were calling things in the first 2 weeks. They were 24% cover 1, man coverage, 24% cover 3, 24% cover 4, 19% cover 2, and 10% cover 6 based off my charting. Compare that to the first 2 games where I charted them as 42% cover 3, 16% cover 4, 13% cover 6, 11% cover 1, 9% cover 2, 5% other. I think Mahomes had an off game. I don't know how much of that was what Jimmy Lake was doing schematically. I think that's debatable. I think a lot of the missed throws that Mahomes had in the game was just his footwork was erratic in this game, and it wasn't erratic because the Falcons were getting pressure and moving him off his spot, because I only counted a 29% pressure rate in this game, which is below that 35% threshold that we've talked about a lot in the past of being what is quote unquote acceptable, good, capable pressure in this league. And the Falcons really struggled in their primary coverage, right? Not so this week, but throughout the season has been cover 3. Only 1 out of the 10 cover 3 plays that they called in this game did I count the Falcons getting pressure. It was the interception by Justin Simmons in the end zone where they brought a 6-man pressure with Caden Ellis coming unblocked on that particular play. And that's a problem because this is going to be your primary coverage and you can't get pressure. And they haven't really been getting pressure consistently in the first 2 weeks when they've been in cover 3, only about a 30% pressure rate. That counted for about 8 times where I counted the Falcons getting pressure on those plays. 2 of those were stunts, including that Judon sack he had against the Eagles last week. 2 were blitzes. So basically half of those 8, pressures that you've had in the first 2 weeks was basically scheme, stunts and blitzes. And the other 4 remaining wins I counted, 2 were by Eddie Goldman, 1 was by Grady Jarrett, and 1 was a hurry by both Onyemata and Judon, where they were successfully able to move Hurts off his spot, even though I don't think it resulted in a negative play. But basically what I'm sitting here telling you in the Falcons' main coverage scheme where they're playing cover 3 and they're usually only rushing 4 guys in those situations, they've dialed up some pressure at times, but it hasn't really consistently got home when they have. If Eddie Goldman ain't on the field, they're not getting pressure. And that's not a good place to be when Eddie Goldman has been your most reliable guy when it comes to that sort of stuff. And most of that, or all of that, all those 2 wins that he had, it was just him feasting on, the young interior of the Steelers offensive line. So that gets us into why we didn't have effective rush against Kansas City. I was disappointed that the Falcons didn't really feature Matthew Judon going up against their left tackle and Wanye Morris like we thought they would. Only 5 snaps according to PFF. And I believe most, if not all of those, came late in the fourth quarter when the Falcons were, playing from behind. Ebiketie got the bulk of that work, and he did good work. I counted 4 pressures for Ebiketie. But part of me wonders, could that have been 8 if you had been putting Matthew Judon there as much as you did Ebiketie? And the reason why the Falcons didn't do that is the Falcons, have left and right outside linebackers, and they generally follow that. Judon and James Smith-Williams get the bulk of the left outside linebacker snaps. And Lorenzo Carter and Arnold Ebiketie split the bulk of the right outside linebacker snaps. And it's similar to what we talked about going into week 1 against Pittsburgh, where Pittsburgh also plays guys on the left side. But when you have TJ Watt and, Alex Highsmith, you have a lot more balance, right, in terms of an elite pass rusher and a very, very good pass rusher. And the Falcons have a very, very good pass rusher in Judon. And, depending on what you think about Arnold Ebiketie and Lorenzo Carter, it's not balanced is basically the point. It's less defensible when you don't have that sort of balance and whatnot. And so to me, this is a classic example of not really featuring your guys to put them in a position of succeed, which is a great way to kind of segue into the run defense. Now, before we get there, despite Jarvis Davis's epic rant on the Locked On Sports Atlanta postcast, I don't think the run game woes really had anything to do with the linebackers. Rewatching the film, he went hard on Troy Andersen in that postcast. Very entertaining. Go check it out if you haven't seen it yet. I thought Troy Andersen played fine. I think you can argue it's probably one of his better games, given the limited body of work. That's not saying a whole lot. It might have been his best game. Most of my issues with Troy Andersen in this game came in coverage, not in run support, where there were instances where the Falcons would be playing zone. He'd take his eyes off the quarterback, key on the man, and that would open up opportunities for Mahomes to do some stuff. I could nitpick some of his questionable run fits and reads and whatnot, but again, a lot of that was just poor eye discipline, sort of keying on the blocking, not the ball carrier, losing track of the ball carrier and whatnot. And again, I think that's nothing major. Like, I think that's something that can get solved with more experience. And that's ultimately where I tend to be a little bit more forgiving of Troy Andersen, given that lack of experience, right? He's played 23 games at linebacker in the NFL. That's about 1.5 years of experience, plus only 2 years in college, right? He did not play linebacker in high school. He only played 2 years of linebacker at Montana State. In high school, he was a quarterback, a wide receiver, and safety. At Montana State, he began his career playing quarterback and running back due to injuries and whatnot. And essentially, with 3.5 years of experience playing linebacker, he's essentially midway through his senior year of college at the linebacker position. So to me, the lack of polish that Troy Andersen currently displays, to me, is very understandable, given that we aren't even in his quote-unquote rookie NFL season yet. And so to me, my thing with Troy Andersen has been all along, it remains, he needs the reps. I think he should get the reps, because I think, if he does hit, like, it significantly raises the ceiling for this defense. The question is, will it hit? That remains to be seen. That's always been the question with Troy Andersen. And if I'm being frank, the odds aren't really that great that he is going to hit, but the odds aren't really that great for any draft pick to hit. The past research I've done is about a 22% hit rate on all draft picks. And a hit in that regard is basically a set it and forget it starter, where you can say that guy's our starter and we don't have to worry about that position for at least another 3, if not 5 years. And most draft picks don't reach that. And again, that's part of the reason why I don't put nearly as much stock in the draft as many of y'all do when it comes to, building it up every offseason. But I do think Troy does need to be out there in order to quote unquote figure it out. Last year was supposed to be that quote unquote figure it out year for Troy. He got injured and missed most of the season. So now this year is that kind of figure it out year. And, that can lead to problematic play and up and down play and whatnot. We saw that in week 2. I don't think that was really as much of an issue in week 3 against the Chiefs as maybe Jarvis thinks it is. But, that's why this stuff is subjective, and, people are entitled to their opinion. And again, it doesn't make me go like, Jarvis, you're a crazy person or anything. We have slightly different opinions about football players. It's no big deal. But getting back to why the Falcons struggled against the run, like we noted last week in our breakdown of the Eagles game, the Chiefs ran a lot out of 11 personnel. The Falcons matched with nickel. They had lighter boxes. The Chiefs had a lot of success running out of their 11 personnel against those lighter boxes like the Eagles did. I think they had an 85% success rate last week, running out of 11 personnel. The Chiefs had a 85% success rate this week, running out of that lighter personnel, 11 personnel, 3 wide receiver sets. And as I noted last week, you don't want that number to be above 45%. So basically, like 85% is egregiously bad. And that gets us to not featuring guys, because several of those times, as we discussed a little bit last week on the All-22 review, is, the Falcons needed to play. The Falcons decided to play with more of their penny fronts, which is that 5-1 front where you have 3 down linemen, 2 outside linebackers, and 1 off-ball linebacker. And that's basically the penny front is still a nickel defense. So you're still trying to stop the pass, but you're getting more bodies on the line of scrimmage to try to find that balance between stopping the run and whatnot. But when the Falcons play their penny fronts for some reason this season, and it was certainly on display several times in this game, rather than having that 3 down linemen being 3 interior D linemen like the Rams typically did, coming from, Jimmy Lake and Raheem Morris coming from that, they kicked Caden Ellis as one of their off-ball linebackers out to the edge, and they kicked their edge rusher, one of their outside linebackers, inside to the 4-eye or 5 technique defensive linemen. So they're basically lined up over an offensive tackle, and having Arnold Ebiketie and James Smith-Williams and Matthew Judon and Lorenzo Carter playing a 4-eye when you have Zach Harrison and TQ Graham and Contavious Street, that's kind of their natural role to play, doesn't make any sense to me. And that's what I mean, where it's like you're not putting guys in a position to succeed. So to me, a lot of the Falcons run game woes were because they have light boxes, they have light bodies up front, and the Falcons trying to play their penny front with lighter bodies doesn't make any sense to me. If I can be frank, that's just being stupid to me. But we'll see if the Falcons make that adjustment moving forward. But I think that was a major contributing factor to why the Falcons have struggled to stop the run. They just have lighter bodies up front, and some of this usage of penny front is even getting even lighter. Like you're trying to use formationally a run defending front, but you're putting personnel out there that isn't really putting those guys in a position to succeed. Lorenzo Carter should not be playing 5 technique. Arnold Ebiketie should not be playing 5 technique. The one snap he did play 5 technique or 4-eye technique in this game. He did a good job, relatively speaking, given the circumstances. But why are you're putting in a position to fail is the point I'm trying to make. So that's why I think the Falcons' run game woes are coming from more so than Troy Andersen being bad. But talking about putting guys in a position to succeed and not knowing your personnel, not putting them in a position to succeed, that gets us to the last point I want to talk about, which is Kyle Pitts. And why isn't he being featured as much in this offense as I think he should be? And we'll break that down to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Today's episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. And, what is something at this stage in your life that you would like to learn? As an adult, do you make time for learning new things as often as you would like, or was that lost in childhood? And therapy can help you reconnect with your sense of wonder, because your back to school era can come at any age. Therapy has taught me positive coping skills, like you can only control what you can control. And I use that every single Sunday when I watch the Atlanta Falcons play. And, that also helps me, it helps empower me to be the best version of myself. And, therapy isn't just for those people that have experienced major trauma. So if you're thinking of starting therapy so that you can be potentially a better version of yourself, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire and you'll get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. I can vouch for that. Rediscover your curiosity with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. So let's wrap up today's episode. And before we get into my criticism of Kyle Pitts' usage, I do want to respond. I know there's going to be some people, the nature of criticism, and people tend to me, overreact when they hear this criticism, right? It creates extremes, right? There's one way, and this to me was the core of the Matt Ryan debate amongst fans, where like when people would criticize Matt Ryan, there will be those people that were like basically say like, oh, you can't criticize Matt Ryan, it's not his fault, it's this. And so it basically, to those people, Matt Ryan deserved no criticism whatsoever, deflected all the criticism. And then you have the opposite end of that, which is people tend to blame everything that went wrong with the team on Matt Ryan, right? And I just want to make that clear before too many of you guys become extremists of your own because you're hearing my criticisms of Jimmy Lakett and Zach Robinson. I don't think these guys are bad at their job. I don't think they're, they should be fired or anything like that. But I think the truth is somewhere in the middle, where it's like they deserve some criticism, but we don't have to take it to the extreme of like, these guys are terrible and they're costing us games. Like, they're not. I'm just sitting here. I'm venting my frustrations and nitpicking a lot. And again, it's 3 weeks into the season. Again, as I said earlier and talked all throughout the offseason, no one, or at least I didn't think, when I say no one, me, I didn't think this team would be a fully formed entity 3 weeks into the season. Most teams aren't fully formed. It's, but because of the injuries and the ticking clock and the importance of the games, that clock is ticking faster, and we need that formation, that fully formed entity to come into fruition sooner versus later, given some of the issues. But that gets us to why I was disappointed with Kyle Pitts' usage. Now, you saw the 50-yard play that set up the touchdown. That was a great play. Kirk's interception in this game was also another corner route on that, similar to that 50-yard play that could have been a big game, but unfortunately Kirk's arm got hit and it wound up being an interception. But really, outside of those two plays, I didn't see a whole lot on the film that showed me that the Falcons were trying to feature Pitts in any major way. And that was something that we talked about leading up to this game, given the Chiefs' struggles covering tight ends. And you saw that on like those two plays. But outside of that, you didn't really see a whole lot. And to me, far too much of what Kyle Pitts was asked to do in this game was, line up outside and just kind of run ISO routes and vertical clear out routes, and not really, and basically, unless the Falcons are trying to throw fades to Kyle Pitts, like they weren't really doing much with him in that regard. And maybe I just have to kind of check my expectations, because I had certain expectations going into the season that we would see Kyle Pitts kind of being featured in the slot role as kind of our version of Cooper Kupp, more so than Ray McCloud, who's kind of been the featured guy in that role, as well as London and Mooney as well, getting some of those reps. And Zach Robinson has loved the dagger concept, which is a dig from the outside receiver, an in-breaker from the outside receiver, a vertical sort of clear out from the inside receiver. And that concept makes total sense given our personnel. Kirk throws that really well. So I'm not saying that how dare you use dagger concepts, but like with Ray McCloud, a lot of his production in the first 2 games came on those dagger concepts. And part of the issue this week, which is why I think McCloud was less effective as a pass catcher in this game, was it seemed like the Chiefs were ready for those dagger concepts and it wasn't there for them. And that was a contributing factor. And I would like, and not to sit here and say that, Pitts needs to get all the dagger concepts, but I would like to see Pitts get utilized more out of slot, as a feature weapon, and whether that's on daggers or other concepts that the Falcons would like to use. Again, as you see with Cooper Kupp with the Rams in this McVay offense, which of course Zach Robinson coming from that offense, his offense is derivative of. The slot receiver is a featured weapon in this offense, and only over the last 2 games. Again, we're flushing week 1 down the toilet. We'll plunge it back up for a second. So, sorry for the bad visual stimuli. But the last 2 games, Kyle Pitts, about only 20% of his snaps have come in the slot. Week 1, that was 44%. If you compare that to the 3 years combined under Arthur Smith, it was 40% of his snaps came in the slot. And, the last 2 weeks, 60% of Pitts' snaps have been inline, right? And so you have basically an inline slot wide receiver ratio of 63, 20, 17 in terms of percentage of his snaps. And my expectations going into the season was like that would be somewhere around like 45% inline, 40% slot, and maybe 15 or 20%, outside or something like that. And so again, maybe I just need to check my expectations. But, it's week 3, as I said. We'll see how things develop and evolve over the course of the season. But, as I stated several times over the offseason, I did not expect this team to be fully formed in September. And this isn't me saying, oh, Zach Robinson is doing a terrible job. That's what the point I'm trying to make. But, I didn't think we would be getting more of Ray McCloud in this offense than we were getting Kyle Pitts. And I wrote an article over the summer for the Falcoholic talking about, Ray McCloud's sort of emergence and, leapfrogging Rondale Moore on the depth chart. But it was mostly focused on he'll be a useful player as a gadget guy because he's an effective blocker he's a more effective blocker than Rondale Moore. That's a big part of why Cooper Kupp does his thing as a slot role, getting the good blocking. But I never really thought the Falcons would treat Ray McCloud like a real number 3 wide receiver. And they played like 90% of their offense out of 11 personnel, those 3 wide receiver sets. So they're treating him like a real number 3 wide receiver. And that's why you heard me say on my season preview episode before week 1, which is I figured, Kadero Hodge will eventually take over as the number 3 wide receiver at some point this year, because I think Hodge is a more complete route runner. He's not as fast as Ray is, and not as good as with the ball in his hand. But Hodge, I think, is, I would argue, the best blocking wide receiver on the team, and then Drake London, and then probably Ray is number 3 on that spot. And so, I think the way that you utilize Ray and keep him involved in the offense is what you saw in that end around, right? Like that type of gadget play. That was an awesome play call by Zach Robinson on that particular play. And I want more of that, especially given some of the concerns with the run game and trying to diversify that to challenge defenses and be creative with how you run the ball. And I want to see moving forward with Zach Robinson, especially given some of the concerns we have, question marks we have. Can you rely on the run game nearly as much given the injuries up front? Can you manufacture run yards, air quotes, run yards with the quick passing game, with, screens and quick passes and whatnot. And you saw the Falcons try to do that in this game with screen passes and swings. To me, the way that they tried to do that with Darnell Mooney getting the bulk of that, to me, is the wrong way of doing it. That's not a strength of Darnell Mooney. Like if I'm going to run screens and swing passes, like that's Bijan, that's Ray McCloud all day, every day, but not Darnell Mooney, right? I think the good version of what Zach Robinson is doing with Mooney specifically is all the intermediate crossers. A lot of Mooney's production and the explosive plays he's got is on those intermediate crossing routes. And that to me is what Mooney does well. That's where he can thrive, right? I did a video over the summer for the Locked On Falcons Insiders comparing a route that Tutu Atwell was an intermediate crossing route. And I'm like, this is perfect for Darnell Mooney. right? But the bad version of Zach Robinson is Mooney on all these screens and swing passes, where Mooney is not a good creator after the catch, right? His speed is effective when you can give him an alley, but he's not making guys miss in the open field. And I did a Locked On Falcons Insider video back in March showcasing that sort of thing. And so that's where we'll end today's episode. For those of you that want to become Locked On Falcons Insiders, if you're a believer in showing versus telling, it is for you. Hit the link in the description below. Wednesday morning, usually after, and that will probably be the case again this week. I dropped the extended All-22 review, so I will show you some of the things that you've heard me tell you about in today's episode with crisp, high-def All-22. So hit that link in the description at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. You'll get a 14-day free trial to check it out. The next couple of extended All-22 reviews, as well as going back and seeing all this old stuff I did over the summer and off-season and last year, available for you if you hit that link in the description below. And then it's $4.99 a month after that 14-day free trial if you want to continue keeping it. So become a Locked On Falcons Insider so you can get that extended All-22 review. Of course, our next episode will be the crossover Thursday episode. We'll be joined by Ross Jackson of Locked On Saints to preview this next matchup between the Falcons and Saints. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen by following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out Locked On NFL, check out Locked On Saints, check out Locked On Sports Atlanta. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.